of them talk like this? Hey, me bloke. I mean, how many of them are...
Yeah.
That may be Australian, I'm not really sure.
We didn't have any Australians up there.
How many were English we would recognize as English?
You had 20 Irish generals that served with Washington, a bunch of Irish generals. You had several Polish generals. You had several French generals.
So how many of the families were split?
Oh, well, let me give you an example. Talking about the Loyalists, when you go to some of the battles in the southern area, like down in North Carolina, you'll find that one of the battles down there in the Revolution was 1,500 Loyalists taking on 1,000 Patriots. 2,500 in the battle. They're all Americans. It is a civil war. It is a loyalist. One of the signers of the Declaration, Richard Stockton, ends up in prison, tortured in prison. He was taken to prison by his loyalist neighbors. British couldn't find him. His neighbors captured him, took him to the British, turned him in. So it was a problem.
If Henry would have left his wife, would she have been captured? If she would have stayed, would they have tried to use the families? Is there any example of families being used or arrested who split, but they used the family or the children to coerce?
You bet. One of the really tough stories in the Revolution is Francis Lewis. Francis Lewis' wife, Elizabeth Lewis, now he's signer of the Declaration. Elizabeth Lewis, he left home so that maybe she'd be safe because they're trying to kill him. Well, they come to the home, they find her, they open fire on the home. She stands out while they open fire, and actually there's a ship in the harbor firing at the house, and the British on the other side firing at it. She stands on the porch while the fire is going on. Cannonball hits right where she's standing, blows upside her, and she just kind of looks down at it. The soldiers attack, they capture her.
They knew who she was.
They knew who she was. They took her off to prison to get Francis to do certain things and get Congress to do certain things. They threw her in prison and brutally treated her. They gave her no clothing, no bed on which to sleep. They would feed her occasionally. That's it. She was in a damp, dark dungeon. Actually, one of her black friends found out where she was, got word back to the family, and got word back to Congress. Congress sent a demand for the British to change the way. They wanted to make an example out of her to show all the other founders, all the other signers, you do this, here's what happened to your family. They got word back to Congress, so Congress said, you change the way you treat. They wouldn't change it. So at that time, George Washington went and captured 2 British loyalist wives and put them in custody and said, okay, we're going to treat them the way you're treating ours unless you change it. Well, that's when they arranged a prisoner exchange, got her out, but she died as a result of what they did to her. But that's the British literally taking part of the family and publicly humiliating, abusing, and torturing her. And she died a hero. I mean, she never backed down. There's a great coin that's been minted showing her in prison. Fellow prisoners would try to cram bread through the keyhole to keep her alive because they just weren't feeding her. And so it really is, there's the coin. You see the coin that was minted afterwards. That's a wife of the signer. But the British would try to use the family.
Ladies, how many knew the story? None.
Mm-hmm.
None.
And that's why Benjamin Franklin on July 4, 1776 said, if we don't all hang together, we will most assuredly all hang separately. They knew they were living loudly for liberty, and it could cost them their lives and their families.
I will tell you that I have noticed, and we're certainly not into these kinds of situations by any stretch of the imagination, but how many here have talked to people, or maybe you yourself, have come to a place to where you know enough of what is true, you know where you think this country may be headed, and you feel the same way, that you'll have to come through me. You'll just have to come through me. Is anybody feeling that way now, or? Yeah. Back in just a second. America. Tonight it's another Founding Friday, Founders Fridays. Tonight it's the women of the American Revolution. With us, David Barton. He is the author of Wives of the Signers, and Jane Hampton Cook. She is the author of The Faith of America's First Ladies, and also the Revolutionary War Battlefield and Blessings. I have to tell you first a real quick story. I was in Denver, I think, this weekend. And I listened to a lady speak. She got up, and she was a grandma. She said, I have 8 8 grandchildren. I was surprised because I was thinking, okay, I've got to stop thinking that she's like hot because she's a grandma. All of a sudden I'm like, wow, my grandma didn't look like that. Anyway, she's talking and she said, you know, things have changed for me. And when we went to war and after September 11th, she said, I started, you know, getting involved and I was writing this and doing this. And she's starting a Patriot group a couple of years ago. And she's got to be exhausted. And she said, I wrote a book about the troops that nobody would publish because they said troops books weren't very popular, but I published it anyway. And she said, and then I decided to write this second book. And she said, and I know nobody will ever talk about it on TV or give it a shot. And she didn't know I was in the audience. And I'm like, oh, yes, somebody will. Because it's called My Rifle with My Rifle by My Side. It's a children's book about the Second Amendment. And, it's just got to just hack the left off like crazy. I know because I got a book one time about, I can't remember what the name of it is, but it's a little boy that goes hunting up and gets a bearskin, needs a bearskin rug because he's cold in the winter and goes and shoots bears. And I have friends, on the left, and I leave that out on the coffee table just for I'll walk away and I'll say, can I get you something to drink? I'll be right back. And then they come back and they're like, oh my gosh, you read this to your kids? Yes, I do. Would you like me to read it to you too? All right, an amazing, accomplished woman. We want to talk about women of the American Revolution, and want to go to Anne first in the audience. And Anne, what are you thinking?
I've been wondering if there were any of the women of the Revolution who had a husband that made the decision to become involved, and yet she didn't want to be. So did she betray them in any way?
Well, I know that James Otis, who is the firebrand, a mentor of John Adams, his wife did not support the revolution. And I don't know that she betrayed him necessarily, but James ended up living with his sister and her Mercy, because that they were all on the same side. And so it did split husbands and wives sometimes. And I don't know about the betrayal part in terms of giving them out.
Was there a sense at all, because I'm doing research now on the Holocaust of Germany, and reading this one story of a couple in Amsterdam, and they had a hard time in their family because they said, don't get involved in the underground, don't do any of this because you're going to get the family killed and stuff. Was there that kind of pressure in the American Revolution?
A great story like that is involving a lot of Quaker families, and Lydia Darragh is a great story.
Because Quakers were pacifists.
Quakers, don't get involved, you stay out of this. If you get involved, we'll kick you out of the church.
Right.
And so
because they were pacifists.
They were pacifist, and because they were pacifists, they tended to lean loyalist, pro-British, because we're not going to support a revolution, and so leave status quo the way it is. And when the British invaded Philadelphia, and as they invaded every city or major cities every winter, they would take it over, and that's why we have the Third Amendment of the Constitution, because they would go in and put the British troops in private homes and say, lady, you take care of these 5 guys, laundry, food, cooking, whatever. Ma'am, you take these. Well, as General Howe got in Philadelphia, he chose the house he wanted for himself. They threw the Americans out. Then they went to a house of the Darrows. Lydia Darrow's the wife, and said, out, we're going to use your house. And she says, I got no place to put my kids. All right, you can stay there, but you give us rooms in which to meet. The rooms were used by a guy named Major John Andre, and he's the guy who later got hung as the spy, Benedict Arnold, the treason attempt, but he's the spy master for the British. And so he would use those rooms in her house. She's a Quaker, not supposed to do anything about this. And one night he came to her and said, Lydia, we need your rooms tonight. I want you all in bed early, and I want you asleep. And so when...
Really, Mr. Fancy Pants? Is that what you want?
He got there, knocked on the door, she let him in, and said, they're all asleep, and said, all right, you go off. I'll awaken you when we want out. And so she went to her room, supposed to get in bed, go to sleep, and she said, something's not right here, something's not. So she went sneaking down the hallway, put her ear up against the keyhole to hear what was happening. Now, they were in winter quarters then. This is December, so the Americans are over in their winter quarters, the British are in theirs, and nobody fights in the winter. 6 months off. No army does anything, and that's just the way they fought wars. So she's listening and hears that in 2 days, the British are going to do a surprise attack on the American winter quarters with 5,000 British soldiers, going to wipe out the American army. You're not supposed to do that. That's not playing fair. So she hears this. She rushes back to bed, gets in it, and when Andre comes to let himself out, he knocks on the door quietly. She didn't answer. So he beat on the door a little louder. She didn't answer. He banged on the door really loud. She gets up kind of groggy and answers the door and lets him out. So she says, what am I going to do? She laid in bed all night and prayed. What am I going to do? The next morning she got up, because she's not supposed to be involved. Next morning she got up and told her husband, I've got to go to the mill outside of town to get some flour. Well, to go outside of town, you're under martial law. She had to go see General Howe, the British commander, and get a pass to get out of town. She got out of town, got to the mill, dropped her bag, went running down the road to find the first American officer she could find, found him, said, you got to let Washington know. Here's what I just heard. Here's what's going to happen. They're coming after you tomorrow. This is now one day down the road. You got to be ready.